Good evening. Welcome to the Ukrainian Institute of America and tonight's special talk, part of our Books at the Institute series of programs. It's the latest within a long-running tradition of our organization's promotion of diverse cultural disciplines reflecting the Ukrainian experience, historic, modern, and contemporary. My name is Andrew Horodisky. From our Indo-European origins, it's Andriy, and I am a board member with the UIA and an advisor to its arts program. Thank you all for your commitment to come out and celebrate the craft of writing and to recognize practitioners whose deep curiosity, research, and imagination bear us the cherished gift of the printed word. And with that, knowledge and understanding on our part. Tonight, we are pleased to greet two very special guests to present and discuss Proto, How One Ancient Language Went Global, written by Paris-based British writer, novelist, and science journalist Laura Spinney, that explores the origins of Proto-Indo-European languages, tracing their evolution and migration patterns through archaeology, linguistics, and genetics. Ms. Spinney will be joined in conversation with Bard College professor, author, and musician Maria Sonevytsky. Many thanks are due to the UIA board president, Kathy Nalovaiko, and executive director, Lydia Zeininger, for their support, encouragement, and expediency in making tonight's program a reality. Dr. Sonevytsky for her ready participation, and to Laura Spinney for graciously accepting our invitation to present what is positioned to be an influential cultural and sociological study. Tonight's event will consist of a brief background presentation followed by a talk, audience Q&A, book signing, and light reception. We hope you can all stay for the reception to further engage with our guests, greet old friends, and make new ones. By purchasing a copy of Proto tonight, and we hope you do, you are supporting the UIA's continued cultural and educational programming and the further enjoyment of its unique happenings made accessible to our friends and community along New York's Museum Mile and beyond. Each of us has a real connection to this landmark study, and I urge you to read it. Proto will awaken your senses, spark curiosity, and stimulate intellectual empathy, all as a result, I promise, you with being greatly rewarded. At the beginning of each program, as is now ritual at the UIA since February 24, 2022, and a constant reminder of what liberty and self-determination signify in a civil and just society, we honor all those who have sacrificed their lives or were victims of brutal attacks in the fight for Ukrainian identity and freedom from tyranny. These include brave soldiers, men and women on the battlefield who come from all walks of life, medical aid and volunteer corps, journalists, cultural workers, and the too many innocents whose only misdeed was to live a normal life, a life we here in the West often take for granted. Please stand and join me for a moment of silence. Thank you. With a delicate maneuver not to spoil the section plots and ensuing narrative stitching, allow me this one quote from Laura Spinney's grand story. The human compulsion to communicate is overwhelming. It was there even before sapiens. Children born deaf have invented sign language to escape what one researcher has called the abysmal loneliness of life without communication. Some argue that without language, there is no reasoning, others that there is no consciousness. But besides this desire to reach out to strangers, there's another one that has deep roots in all of us, the desire to belong to our own groups, end quote. The author traces the echoes of humanity's earliest voices to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, where the community of herders and wanderers once spoke the mother tongue of nearly half the world's languages. Words, she shows us, are living archives of human movement and imagination. Following their trails from the grasslands of Ukraine, southern Russia, Kazakhstan to the distant corners of Eurasia, Ms. Spinney reveals how sound, meaning, and culture spread together through distant migration, trade, and storytelling. Historical linguistics for Laura Spinney is an archaeology of the mind, using comparative and computational tools to reconstruct forgotten speech and with it, the journeys of ancient peoples. By linking linguistics with genetics and archaeology, she illuminates how early communication shaped later civilizations and how understanding these shared roots deepens empathy, showing that many voices of the world all emerged from a common spring. Beyond its scholarly reach, Ms. Spinney's study reminds us that tracing the origins of words, their root similarities, and the languages they build is also a meditation on belonging. Understanding how our diverse modes of expression stemming from a single ancestral source instills in all of us both humility and wonder. It shows that communication, so often seen as a divider of modern peoples and nations, was once and still can be a force for connection. Laura Spinney is a writer and science journalist. Her writing on science has appeared in The Guardian, The Economist, Nature, and National Geographic, among other journals. She is the author of 2 novels, The Doctor and the Quick, and a collection of oral history, Rue Centrale. Her best-selling nonfiction account of the 1918 flu pandemic, Hail Rider, the Spanish flu of 1918, and How It Changed the World, was translated into more than 20 languages. Her latest book, Proto, How One Ancient Language Went Global, the story of the Indo-European languages, appeared in 2025, published by Bloomberg. Ms. Spinney lives and works in Paris. Maria Sonevytsky is the author of Wild Music, Sound and Sovereignty in Ukraine, Vokli Vidoplesova's Tanci, and a forthcoming book on Soviet children's musical culture at the Kyiv Palace of Pioneers, in addition to numerous articles. She is a professor of anthropology and music at Bard College in New York's Hudson Valley. As a musician, she has performed in venues ranging from the Metropolitan Museum of Art to punk cafes in Kyoto to Gogol Fest in Kyiv. Please give a warm welcome to Laura Spinney and Maria Sonevytsky.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Andrew. Language is political. I probably don't need to tell this audience that. Can you hear me?
Closer on the mic.
I'm closer on the mic. Can you hear me? Is that better? I'll try it. Language is political. I probably don't need to tell this audience that. On the other hand, it's important to preface all that follows with that statement. The language we speak is so intimately tied up with who we are, along with our genes and our culture, that it couldn't really be otherwise. Politics is encrusted deep in the definition of a language. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy, said the linguist and Yiddishist Max Weinreich, and he was not far wrong. You might have heard, for example, that the speakers of 2 languages cannot understand each other, whereas the speakers of 2 dialects can. But it turns out that this criterion of mutual intelligibility is often not observed. Take the fact that speakers of northern and southern German dialects don't understand each other, but Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians, who supposedly speak distinct languages, do. Oops. That is supposed to be a Bavarian on the left and a Prussian on the right. It's a little bit of a cheat because actually it's the Prussian uniform on the left, being worn by a Bavarian grandfather, and it's the German imperial uniform on the right being worn by his grandson in 1913, so after unification of Germany. But it's also making a nice point for me about how genes and language and culture don't necessarily travel together. Prussian and Bavarian officers in the German army fighting France in 1870 couldn't understand each other and had to communicate in the language of the enemy, French. Another common way of distinguishing a language and a dialect is to say that a language has a standard written form under literature, whereas a dialect is oral and does not. But that criterion doesn't work very well either. Ancient Greek is definitely a language and definitely had a literature, right? Think of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the foundational texts of European literary culture. Except that, oops, the Iliad and the Odyssey were handed down orally for generations before they were recorded. And the same is true of the Vedas, the oldest Indian and Hindu scriptures, which were sung in Sanskrit or a closely related language for a very long time before they were first written down. So Weinreich was pretty much on the money. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Or as John McWhirter, a linguist at Columbia University here in New York, once wrote, a language is a dialect that got put up in the shop window. But it isn't just about definitions. Language is constantly changing. We change it both unconsciously, when babies introduce minor errors to the template that's presented to them, and consciously, as for example, when two people speaking closely related dialects, or languages, introduce subtle or not so subtle changes to distinguish theirs from their neighbours. This is a recognized linguistic phenomenon called dissociation, and it's where the politics works its way in again. It's happening right now in Ukraine. Even those of us who are not directly affected by the war, who don't speak a Slavic language, are aware by now that Ukrainians and Russians pronounce Kyiv differently. According to the most recent data I have, which may actually already be out of date, Ukrainian and Russian differ by about 38% in terms of vocabulary. Ukraine is actually close to Polish on that measure, at about 30% difference. And by way of comparison, French and Spanish differ by 40% and Spanish and Italian by 33%. Phonologically, that is in terms of sound, the differences between Ukrainian and Russian are quite significant, I believe. And that fact has been instrumentalized, weaponized, if you like, in the current conflict. Take the word palyanitsa. Did I pronounce it right, Miriam?
Very close.
Which means a loaf of bread. It's being used as a shibboleth, a code word, that is, by which Ukrainian troops identify undercover Russian agents, because it's pronounced slightly differently in the two languages. So much for current affairs, but we can also turn around and look backward to a time when Ukrainian and Russian were less far apart, to when, along with Czech, Polish, Bulgarian and many other Slavic languages, they were one, Proto-Slavic, proto coming from the Greek meaning first or parent. And there was another time, further back, when they were indistinguishable from the Baltic languages, when a single language called Proto-Balto-Slavic, that's what the linguists call it, probably the speakers didn't call it that, was spoken. If you go further back still, then many linguists think you'll reach a time, a little over 4,000 years ago, when the Slavic languages were indistinguishable from those of Zarathustra and the Vedic poets of India, the Indic and Iranic languages spoken in their modern forms by millions across South and Southwest Asia today. Go back one more step to about 5,000 years ago, and you get to a language that linguists refer to as Proto-Indo-European, the last common ancestor of all the Indo-European languages spoken in the world today. The common ancestor, that is, of the languages spoken by nearly half of humanity. This map shows the modern distribution of the Indo-European languages. It comes from Ethnologue, which is an online catalogue of languages. And the only curiosity about this map is that Australia and New Zealand are not blue. But other than that, I think it's pretty accurate. The Indo-European language family is the largest language family on Earth today, and that's true whether you measure it by number of speakers or by geographical spread. There it is. The family encompasses the Indic, Iranic, Baltic, and Slavic languages that I just mentioned, but also the language I'm speaking, English, and her Germanic sisters, the Romance languages descended from Latin, the Celtic languages, Greek, Albanian, and Armenian, and two dead branches, Anatolian, once spoken on the Turkish peninsula and including the language of the great Hittite Empire, and Tocharian, once spoken at the frontier of modern China on the Silk routes, and hence the family's easternmost branch. It's a little mind-blowing to travel backwards in this linguistic time machine, I'm sure you'll agree. And in principle, there's nothing to stop you going all the way back to the first languages that humans spoke on the plains of Africa 100,000 years ago or more. There's an unbroken chain of linguistic evolution there, millennia of accumulated conscious and unconscious changes. In practice, we don't have the tools to probe language at such great time depths. We can go back about as far as 10,000 years, which is the window of time in which most scholars agree the Indo-European language family was born. But first of all, I'm going to take a gigantic step back before that to give you a bit of context to this story. We know from archaeology that the main migration of our species, Homo sapiens, out of Africa, the one that led to the peopling of the rest of the globe, happened about 60,000 years ago. At that time, the world was in the grip of an ice age, and this long ice age reached an extremely chilly nadir about 20,000 years ago. At that point, glaciers covered most of the western end of Eurasia, for example. The humans who survived this very cold snap did so by following their prey into so-called warm weather refuges. Around 14,000 years ago, 1-4, the world began to warm again. The glaciers began to melt. The survivors moved out. They were still hunter-gatherers, but starting around 12,000 years ago, some of them invented farming. And since farming could support more people than hunting and gathering for the same patch of land, their populations began to grow. The population's languages grew with them. They grew, they fragmented into dialects, and some of those dialects became languages in their own right. This was how many of the language families that are still spoken today, including Indo-European, came to be. Proto-Indo-European, the last common ancestor of all the Indo-European languages, has been dead for over 4,000 years, and it was never written down. Writing was only invented about 5,000 years ago in Sumer, modern Iraq, and the oldest written records we have of an Indo-European language are Hittite, dating to 4,000 years ago. They are in fact the Hittite royal archives, stored on clay tablets at Hattusha in north-central Turkey, Hattusha being the Hittite capital. So how, you may ask, can we say anything at all about that older language, Proto-Indo-European? How on earth did linguists arrive at the family tree that I showed you? The answer is, Andrew alluded to it, the comparative method. They painstakingly compared corresponding words, sounds, meanings, and grammatical constructions across Indo-European languages, across languages that they deemed to be related and to be descended from the same common ancestor. And not only the living Indo-European languages, but also historical languages that were dead but that we knew were spoken because we had records of them, languages such as ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Latin. And this comparison allowed them to place the languages in relation to each other, further or closer apart in the tree, depending on the degree of similarity. And because linguists know that sounds change in predictable ways, given the physical constraints of our vocal and cognitive apparatus, they could also say things about the order in which the languages emerged, their relative chronology, their relative age. And besides reconstructing the family tree, they also made attempts to reconstruct the dead languages themselves. The parent languages of each branch, so Proto-Germanic, Proto-Celtic, Proto-Italic, and so on, and ultimately the mother of them all, Proto-Indo-European. Here's an example, the word wheel. On the right, you see the various words for this concept in documented historical Indo-European languages. And on the left, you see how linguists have reconstructed the ancestral form of all those words, the one that, through regular sound changes, gave rise to the word in each daughter branch. The funny letters, the K with the superscript W, is just the way that linguists have essentially adapted the English alphabet in order to capture the sounds that Proto-Indo-European used that English does not use. So that word sounds something like kweklos, kweklos. And the asterisk in front of it is the convention that the historical linguists adopted to indicate a reconstructed word. That is, a hypothetical word, one that their best guess of what it sounded like, but it's never been documented, therefore we can't be sure it really was uttered. Slowly, in this way, the linguists began to rebuild the vocabulary of Proto-Indo-European. To date, they've reconstructed about 1,600 words, or to be exact, stems of words. So each stem you can change it with the rules of grammar and you get a bunch of words. This lexicon represents a mere skeleton of the language as it was once spoken, but it's an impressive feat of resuscitation nevertheless, if you remember that the language has been dead for 4,000 years. And because a language is a mirror of its speaker's world, because people talk about the things that matter to them, the world they gaze out upon, the animals and plants they eat, their ideas about why things are the way they are, linguists could start to ask, based on this lexicon, who might have spoken Proto-Indo-European, where they lived and when. They may not have had any history books to consult for those distant time periods, but they did have the next best thing, archaeologists. The archaeologists could tell them, based on their excavations, that certain people lived in this region at this time in the past, that they lived in houses that looked like this and kept this kind of animal and were familiar with these materials and technologies, and buried their dead this way with these kinds of grave goods. And the linguists could consult their reconstructed vocabularies for a match. Were there words for the things the archaeologists have found? Did the speakers of Proto-Indo-European talk about those things? Did they inhabit such a world? Putting their heads together in this way, the linguists and the archaeologists began to suspect, some of them at least, that Proto-Indo-European was spoken in the steppes of Eastern Europe, modern-day Russia and Ukraine, by a nomadic people they called the Yamnaya, or Yamna, who lived about 5,000 years ago and who survived in those hostile grasslands by moving constantly with their herds in search of new pastures. That wasn't the only theory, however. There were rivals. One prominent rival placed Proto-Indo-European in what is now Turkey, several millennia earlier. For a long time, it wasn't really possible to choose between these theories. It was difficult to explain how, for example, if Proto-Indo-European was born in the steppes, it gave rise to daughter languages spoken from Ireland to the Himalaya. The Anatolian thesis, the Turkish thesis, faced a similar challenge. But all that changed about 20 years ago, when a new tool came online. And this new tool is the reason I wrote my book Proto Now, because it changed everything. It tipped the odds massively in favour of the steppe hypothesis, the idea, that is, that the Indo-European languages were born on the grasslands of Eastern Europe, that Proto-Indo-European was spoken by those nomads called the Yamnaya. And that tool was ancient DNA. About 20 years ago, it became possible to extract DNA from ancient human bones and teeth, and to glean things from it about those ancient humans. Things like their sex, what they looked like, how they were related to each other, what diseases they suffered from, and perhaps most importantly, from the point of view of this story, whether and how far they migrated. Suddenly it became possible to see that the Yamnaya and their descendants, those nomadic people who thought nothing of travelling gigantic distances with their herds, radiated out from their homelands north of the Black and Caspian seas, heading huge distances east and west to all the parts of Eurasia where we know the Indo-European languages were spoken already in the ancient world. The orange on this map, by the way, shows the steppe, and the arrows show the Yamnaya and their descendants radiating out from that steppe homeland. You don't really need to pay attention to more of the detail than that. So that's the story that I recount in much greater detail in Proto. And I want to be very clear, the Yamnaya heartland did not fall neatly into any modern national boundaries, as you can see. They roamed freely throughout the steppe. Having said that, the great tragedy, the historical irony, is that this story has crystallized at a time when at least part of that heartland has become a war zone. Not for the first time, of course, but there's a particular poignancy in knowing that some of the archaeological sites that have yielded the oldest Yamnaya remains, and the museums to which those remains were transported, have either been destroyed or are off limits, and may remain so for a very long time. I began this talk by saying that language is political, which is true. The language or languages we speak are inextricably tangled up with our identity. But this identity function exists in tension with another, which is quite simply our need to communicate. Language is a tool, possibly humanity's oldest, and as a tool it enables us to better adapt to our environment. It does so by allowing us to communicate with each other. And what do we communicate about? The world around us, which is ever-changing. This means that a language that stands still, a language that governments or academies try to preserve in aspic, is doomed. Languages are, by their very nature, dynamic. They must change to remain useful, and hence to survive. This is the message of the Indo-European story and of my book, Proto. The most successful language the world ever knew, Proto-Indo-European, was a hybrid trafficked by migrants. There was nothing inherently successful about it. It survived and spread as long as its speakers did. It changed in the process, and when it stopped changing, it died. I'd like to end with 2 short readings, or rather one recital and one reading. One first to transport you back viscerally into the past, the other to anchor you firmly in the present again. So first, the recital, which comes courtesy of Riccardo Ginevra, a rising star of historical linguistics who works at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan, Italy. And with another linguist, Andrew Bird of the University of Kentucky, Riccardo has painstakingly reconstructed not only some of the Proto-Indo-European language that its speakers would have used day to day, but also some of the myths they told at night under the stars, perhaps while smoking cannabis or sipping mead. They have done so once again by applying the comparative method, in this case to the myths that modern Indo-European speakers have inherited. The myth you're about to hear is that of the dragon slayer, the ancestor, that is, of all the Indo-European dragon slayers who will be familiar to you. Sigurd or Siegfried in the Germanic tradition, Bellerophon in the Greek one, he who killed the Chimera in the Iliad, and Indra in the Indic. Indra, for anyone who's read the Rig Veda, slayed the dragon Vritra with a thunderbolt, thus releasing life-giving water back to his people. He is depicted here. The linguists have reconstructed the ancestral form of that myth, and you're about to hear it performed by Phil Barnett, sounding just as it would have done on the steppes of Ukraine 5,000 years ago. It works.
Memon chatom, tertom ten chantam, Hios kietrum terchuti, hiom portus degom berit, heguint, hoguim. Suchnus pachtres die ues portausqueter meskunto, ten chansen nomen, me dun mertois deois biboti. Wirums, becu que best, dui perums queter perums que best. Heguint, hoguim. Gunto hoguis udeni, budnoi, reguesu. Hoguis proteros ten chantem mertoms deuoms quepterhut. Equent virums becuque, dui perums queter perums que. Ten chants bunect, wagrum queter tres dect. Heguent, hoguim.
I don't know about you, that sends shivers down my spine. And then finally, Since we're here at the Ukrainian Institute of America, we thought we would end with a poem by a Ukrainian poet, Leszek Panasiuk. Thank you, Maria. Maria's kindly going to read it in Ukrainian first, and then I'll read the English translation by Ilya Kaminsky and Katie Farris at The Atlantic magazine.
I'm going to put my seat here.
Yeah.
So before I read the poem, I ran this by you, but the book also touches in the conclusion on diasporic language, because Laura writes about her partner who was born into a Polish family that fled the Soviet Union or the oncoming Red Army in 1940. Which is quite similar to my family's story of fleeing Ukraine in the same time. So before I read this poem in modern Ukrainian for you, I just want to flag that I was born into a tradition of Ukrainian speaking that was enmeshed in a different historical moment, right, 1939. And I've tried to update this language over the years, but as you read, you can also consider the politics of the Ukrainian language that I speak. Абетка як палата для поранених. Чуєш цей рух у стовбурах, це мова тече в дерев'яних жилах і буяє пустоцвітом. Мова чорна, мов земля, чорна, мов кров, що тягне нас у землю. Червоні пера застрягли в чорнильницях наших ротів, повні крові, наче під час бійки. Кожне слово завдає болю. Щоб зараз лишитися живими, треба мовчати. Сипучі піски мови тягнуть нас на дно. Літери йдуть на війну. Складаються в слова, які ніхто не хоче вимовляти. Речення підриваються на мінах. Історії обстрілюють системами заплового вогню. У слово «дім» влучає снаряд. Крізь розбите вікно літери «Д» можна побачити, як літера «І» втрачає голову, як провалюється дах літери «М». Мову в час війни не впізнати. Речення такі недолугі. Ніхто не хоче помирати. Ніхто не хоче говорити. Біля лікарняного ліжка літери «Й» лежить протез, діакритичного знака якого вона соромиться, уже вкотре розходяться шви просвітами літери «Ф». Від кульових поранень на етимологічному фронті м'який знак втратив язик під час катування. Палати забиті літерами, що і апострофа не вставиш. Відпадає фарба зі стін, осипаються слова незрозумілими покручами, і хто ними буде говорити.
In the hospital rooms of my country, letters of the alphabet go to war, clinging to one another, standing up, forming words no one wants to shout, sentences that are blown by the mines in the avenues, stories shelled by multiple rocket launches. A Ukrainian word is ambushed. Through the broken window of the letter D, other countries watch how the letter E loses its head, how the roof of the letter M falls through. The language in a time of war can't be understood. Inside this sentence is a hole. No one wants to die. No one speaks. By the hospital bed of the letter J lies a prosthesis it's too shy to use. You can see the light through the clumsily sewn-up holes of the letter F. The soft sign has its tongue torn out due to disagreements regarding the etymology of torture. There is too much alphabet in the hospital rooms of my country. Too much alphabet. No place to stick an apostrophe. Paint falls off the walls, showering us with words incomprehensible, like men who, in wartime, refuse to speak.
It's a really powerful poem, and I'm also moved by the fact that it's translated by Russophone Ukrainians. So the original language of the poem is Ukrainian, but the translators are primarily Russian-speaking Ukrainians, poets. In any case, beautiful. Thank you for writing this book. It was such a pleasure to read it. For people who haven't yet read it, it's at times like a spy thriller kind of vibe. It's just full of wonder and marveling at this deep history. There are so many like lovely evocative phrases that I just kept writing myself. I'm primarily a scholar who's written for other scholars with some ambitions to write for non-scholars. And so anytime I see that done well, I really admire it. So at the very beginning, for example, we get this like super lively, engaging language where you invite the reader to plunge into Narnia, this newly written prehistory with you. And then there's this real sense of wonder that you convey as you take us through this story. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation in front of you, and then we'll invite you to pose your own questions. The first question I wanted to ask as we plunge into this Narnia is how you came to this project.
Yeah, it's a good question. I had, as a science journalist, been interested in language for a long time, but more in sort of in the neuroscience of it, the psychology of it. And then I happened to be at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico in the summer of 2022. I was lucky enough to be chosen as a journalism fellow on their complexity science summer school. And that brings together a lot of PhD and postdoc students from every possible discipline who want to understand how the maths and the physics of complexity can be applied in their field. Very, very, very smart people, way smarter than me. And there were some linguists in the mix. And in the midst of our interdisciplinary conversations, I began to realize how excited the linguists were about what was happening since this ancient DNA tool came along, like a tool from way outside their own field that was transforming their field. And just that idea alone was rather fascinating. But I am a wannabe archaeologist, I have to confess that up front. And the archaeology in cahoots with, if you like, with the genetics has just blasted open prehistory and is having such an impact in so many areas of it, including language, that the idea crystallized in my mind. This is a story that needs to be written. And also because not only, my prime target is the general public, the people who are interested in this subject but don't have any technical expertise in it, but also I heard more than once people in the three fields who are trying to collaborate to bring the truth out, the linguists, the archaeologists, and the genetics, say to me, we don't necessarily speak the same language as each other. So, here for once was maybe a useful service that a journalist could provide in translating them to each other.
You, in fact, characterize it in the book as a kind of irony that the linguists, the archaeologists, and the geneticists are barbarians to one another.
Yeah.
Which I would love for you to kind of decode for the audience who hasn't read the book yet. Why this choice of
Yeah, because the original meaning of barbarian is somebody who speaks a foreign language. It's the classic definition of the other. The person who stutters, it has also that meaning. Or who speaks blah blah, baba, rhubarb. These are all the same meaning, and so people who don't understand somebody else's language are very literally barbarians to each other.
And so, what has the consequence been of these different sets of experts not speaking the same language? Where does that kind of come out in the story that you tell? It's
an operational obstacle, I suppose, but it is part of the whole richness of the story. It's not something that can be swept aside. So to give you an example, a geneticist, archaeologist, and a linguist have different concepts of identity, right? So, the linguist, however they define a language, that's one idea of an identity. Archaeologists look at sort of assemblies of objects that they pull out of the ground, which is, and they call that a culture and they give it a name, like, for example, Yamnaya. And, they define where the assembly begins and ends. And then for geneticists, obviously, it's the genetic makeup of a person is their identity. And all of these things change according to different mechanisms, from over time, from generation to generation, but all of them are absolutely integral to who we are and how we think of ourselves. You know, you can't have human identity with just one of those or even just two of those. They're all key. So, you know, though they are transmitted differently, you know, you get your genes from your parents, but you can get language from anyone, from an app, from a book. So these things are transmitted differently, but they're all critical. They need to be woven together into the story of human identity.
And the book is so synthetic in the way that it presents this information. So I'm tempted to ask you a question about process, but that might be something for the cocktail hour later. It might only be interested to those of us who are nerds about writing books. But I was hoping to ask you to talk a little bit more. So in the presentation, we heard about a super intriguing word, which I will mispronounce now, kweklos.
Kweklos, oui.
Which you translated here as wheel. In the book, you give us some of the controversy around how this term can be understood and how it also then maps onto what I think is characterized throughout as the steppe hypothesis versus the Anatolian hypothesis. So could you go deeper?
It's a really good question because this illustrates how how the collaboration of the linguists and the archaeologists can work and where it's problematic. So the controversy is whether that word, that wheel word, always applied to the technology of the wheel, the actual round object, you know, with spokes and a wooden rim that moves a vehicle. Because the wheel was only invented about 3,500 BC, so about 5,500 years ago. And so if it meant that object, then whoever spoke Proto-Indo-European must have lived forward of that time. But there are those linguists who say that, well, the word could initially have applied to something more abstract, something like a cycle. I mean, humans, after all, have always known things that turn. The sun, the moon, the menstrual cycle. So, perhaps that's what it meant originally, and then only later it took on the sense of the technology, wheeled transport. So that's the debate. But because words have also been reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European that mean things like to transport in a vehicle, there's a reconstructed verb that means that, or axis, or wagon, that ensemble of vocabulary that suggests the more technological definition has persuaded most linguists, I think it's fair to say it's the consensus, that whoever spoke that language did indeed know wheeled technology, and therefore they lived forward of 4,000, 3,500 BC.
And that then positions them in this north of the Black and Caspian Sea too.
Exactly. And in many ways it sort of eliminates, it's a point against the Anatolian thesis, because that's the idea that it was the early farmers in what is now Turkey who spoke this language several millennia earlier, and that would have been before the wheel was invented. So it's one of the arguments against that hypothesis.
Right, a Proto-Indo-European, lingua obscura.
Yeah.
So if the steppe hypothesis has gained so much traction, it has centered primarily on these Yamna or Yamnaya people who are distinguished by their method of burying their dead.
Yes.
Yama in Ukrainian means pit, and this is
pit grave, exactly. Yeah.
What do we know about the Yamna? What have we been able to deduce on the basis of their ancient DNA and also of what has been reconstructed of their language?
Yeah. So they, as an archaeological culture, emerged a little before 3000 BC, so a little before 5,000 years ago. Somewhere in that area, some of the oldest archaeological sites which have yielded Yamnaya remains come from the lower Don area, but since the whole area has not been excavated comprehensively, we can't say that those are actually the oldest. And they were very mobile. They were essentially the prototype of the Mongols, the Huns, the Scythians, all those people who moved through the steppe in later periods of prehistory and history. They were the ones who invented this incredibly mobile lifestyle. Before them, their ancestors basically stuck mostly to the river valleys in the steppe lands, and they would venture out when the grass was grazed down in order to find fresh grass for their herds, but they always came back, and their villages in those river valleys remained inhabited all the year round. The Yamnaya took transhumance to the next level, and they just moved all the year round with their herds, moving from pasture to pasture, seeking out the fresh pastures, and moving in circles, and sort of developing the technology and the knowledge in a way that allowed them to do that. They needed to know where to go, at what season, where the water was, where the snow was not too deep. They had wheeled transport, which meant that they lived in, they literally, I mean, the archaeologists, the sort of archaeological footprint of the Yamnaya is essentially burial pits, these great big kurgans, burial mounds that you can still see today in long lines across the steppe. Their campsites are almost invisible, very hard to find. For decades, archaeologists couldn't find them because they were so ephemeral. They were so left such a light mark in the landscape. They would stop, then they would move on, build another camp somewhere else. They lived either out of their wagons themselves or tents. They were skilled metal workers. They lived off a very high protein diet, milk and meat provided by their animals. They wore the skins that their animals furnished. They burnt the manure of their animals. And what else can I say about them? And they were so well adapted to that. The point, in a way, is that they were so well adapted to that environment that first of all, they grew very tall. They were immensely tall for their time. They lived quite long. There were some sexagenarians, septuagenarians, which was rare for those days. And they had a huge population explosion, which is why archaeologists think they have to move out of those heartlands and move east and west, carrying their languages with them.
Fascinating. So can we talk a little bit about some of these reconstructed words? We've already heard about kweklos, this wheel or round word, but there's a number of other reconstructed words throughout the book. I made a note of some of them, but only in their English contemporary, because I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it.
You're going to give me the hard work of pronouncing it.
But the word daughter, and in fact, all of the kind of nuclear family terms are there. Ghost, host,
hostess,
mouse, father sky is one that comes up a lot. My question is, do you have a favorite among these?
I have a few favorites. Is that cheating? I mean, I love the father sky one, which I start the book with. So in Sanskrit, in the Vedas that I referred to a couple of times, the supreme deity, the most powerful god, is called Dyao Pita. Dyao meaning sky, and Pita meaning father. So sky father, but we would say in English father sky. And if you ask who was the most powerful god in the Roman pantheon, who was it? Anybody? Jupiter. Jupiter, which became anglicized as Jupiter. And in ancient Greek, Zeus Pater. It's the same formulation, just with the sound changes that came down the Greek line. Obviously, we shortened it to Zeus or Zeus. So it's the same name, the same god, essentially. He does acquire different stories and different adventures in the different branches. It's the same root that gives us Tyr, the ancient Old Norse god of thunder and war, and Tu, who's the Old English equivalent, which is the root of Tuesday. So that's one. Can I say another?
I mean, I would invite you to speak to all of them. Yeah, go ahead. Let's have more.
The other one I love is the star word, because Aster in ancient Greek, the star that Odysseus would have followed, Stjarna in Icelandic, Isteri was the Sogdian word. So there's those merchants on the ancient Silk roads who spoke Sogdian very often. On their camels at night were following the steri. So essentially the same word that's been reconstructed. The Proto-Indo-European reconstruction is something like chester. I may not be getting these pronunciations exactly right. I'm not a linguist myself, but chester. There's quite a lot of gutturals in Proto-Indo-European. And I love that idea in part because, well, first of all, we've always looked up at the heavens and seen these twinkly things and wondered about them. And, the same word has been used by people for thousands of years, essentially. But also, I was talking to someone the other day who, on a podcast, who mentioned an Austrian poet called Raoul Schrott, I think his name is, who's just written a book about myths, ancient myths that feature stars and constellations. And his idea is that the Africans who came out of Africa, the sapiens who came out of Africa and sort of succeeded in peopling the rest of the globe, because there were plenty of unsuccessful migrations out of Africa, probably, were the ones who knew how to navigate by the stars. And so they're the ones whose stories and whose names and whose words and language related to the stars came out with them and is preserved in the living languages descended from theirs.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's so interesting. I'm thinking I'm going to ask you 2 more questions for now. I have many more questions than that. But I'm letting the audience know so that you can get your own questions ready. And if you don't have questions, I will keep asking questions until the time is done. So maybe returning a little bit to the topic of the politics of language, which is not really the primary concern of your book, but it does come in very strongly, I would say, at the end in particular. And even when we look at a map, like where the Indo-European languages are spoken today, it suggests politics in a lot of different ways, right? Even where we are in North America, we understand that the Indo-European languages come here through violent conquest. And again, your book is not focused on 1492 and what followed, but it's implicit in the kind of the triumph or the success, as you put it, of the Indo-European languages. In the end of the book, you are reporting from the contemporary Black Sea area. You take us to Varna, you take us to Rostov, and you write towards the end of the book, quote, "Migration has been a constant. Indigenous is relative," end quote. And you also write in that same section about the efforts of contemporary linguistic activists to preserve threatened languages. So on the one hand, the book gives us an account of whole branches that have vanished, right? The Anatolian, Tocharian branches are gone. On the other hand, there's the sympathy for the languages that are threatened today. So I'm curious how this study has made you think about languages that are vulnerable today. I'm of course thinking of here as a Ukrainianist, but I'm also thinking of someone who has studied some indigenous languages and has interest in that area too.
I mean, I try to think about it in a without value judgments, in the sense that I think there'll always be diversity in language around us because language is always changing. So I'm a little bit skeptical, I have to say, about all this kind of alarmist talk about the vanishing of languages in one sense, because I think that new forms will emerge and you know, they always have and they always will. But things are going very fast now, partly because of technology. And if you think about this, I find this staggering. Only about 10% of the roughly 7,000 living languages in the world today are well documented. Most of them are not documented. And if you think about those 7,000 are a drop in the ocean compared to the languages that have ever been spoken. Someone estimated that perhaps 500,000 languages have been spoken in the history of our species. And obviously most of those were spoken before writing was invented, so they've just vanished. We've got no way of getting them back. And each of those languages contains a body of knowledge, the history of the people, their beliefs, their culture, their cooking recipes, their jokes, you know, everything, their beliefs. So first of all, I think you have to make a distinction between saving a language and recording it. And recording it, I think, is crucial and vital. And then, so when I try not to make value judgments, when it comes to saving languages, I think if people are attached to it enough to revive it, to teach it to their children, and the children, you know, have a reason to keep speaking it because it is the vehicle for a vibrant culture, then that language should and will survive. It's a way, you know, in a way, it's the proof is in the pudding. So, but yeah, you know, a language is a tool. It has to be useful. If people are giving up their languages, which are so tied to their identity, it's for a reason. And it's because they're taking on other languages which are, you know, more useful to them in terms of improving their status, improving their children's chances, and so on. And that's what we have to understand before we go into this conservation game, I think.
Yeah, interesting. I was really struck by the point also made by, if I'm remembering correctly, a a scholar. in this
Yes,
room, the Congo.
Saliko Mufweni. He's actually at the University of Chicago, but he's Congo-born, yeah.
Right, Congo-born scholar who was responding to the kind of concern around English in particular as a killer language. Is that the right phrase? Right? And this Congo-born scholar points out that in much of the world where English has become the lingua franca, there's actually a vibrant culture of multiple languages coexisting, right?
Yeah,
and that
yeah.
English becomes the language of certain facets of life, perhaps, but that it's actually really in Europe and in
Absolutely.
America, maybe the Americans, I think, maybe most acutely, where we have these monolingual kind of.
Yeah, so his point, I think, is that, you know, in monolingual Europe and North America is where the panic is about the vanishing languages, whereas in most of the rest of the world, people understand that you can stably have multilingualism, and that is the pattern in most of the world. It was the pattern through most of history, and there's no reason why it couldn't be the case again. This is a European speciality to have excluded all the variants.
So my last question before I open to the audience, and to return us to Ukraine, since we are here at the Ukrainian Institute of America, for you to speak a little bit more about how Russia's war on Ukraine has impacted the prospects for further research. And I will just say that in the conclusion, we're taken quite unexpectedly to Azovstal, which has been a major theater and a site in the war. The steel plant that was built during the Soviet era, but that also housed the kind of key to some of the huge insights that we've gotten from this paleogenetic research. So how is the war currently impacting the prospect for future research?
Yeah, so those steelworks, which were obviously the scene of the siege of Mariupol in May 2022. Yes, thank you. So when they were building those steelworks in the 1930s, they realized that they had disturbed some ancient burials, and they called in a Ukrainian archaeologist called Mikhail Makarenko. And he did a rescue excavation, and he basically realized that it was a very ancient cemetery, and that this is obviously long before genetics, he had any genetic tools, ancient DNA, but he could already see with his expert archaeologist's eye that in this cemetery there were influences, cultural influences from very far east, Siberia, from the Caucasus and locally. So he could already divine, if you like, that there were mixings going on here, and you know that which suggested that people were traveling long distances and trading with each other, exchanging with each other thousands of years ago. And so in a way he had a sort of foretaste of the linguistic mixing that we now know was happening in that area. So the great tragedy and irony is the destruction now of those of the steelworks, the people who died in the course of that siege, of course, but also the fact that the few burials that were saved from the initial rescue excavation were transferred to the local history museum in Mariupol, which has also been destroyed. So, I told that story obviously as an illustration of the fact that the war has completely interrupted any kind of archaeological or on-site research. Of course, the work in historical linguistics goes on relatively unimpeded, but since this is a collaboration of the three sciences, it's obviously a major break on further understanding. There are papers still coming out because of the work, academic work is slow, and they're still processing samples collected before the war. But when it comes to the actual collection of new samples, nothing. And many of those sites have been destroyed. There have been silver linings as well. There was one very ancient early Yamnaya site which had been drowned when the dam, the Kakhovka dam, was put up on the Dnipro.
Sorry, when it was put up by the Soviets.
When it was put up in the 30s, when it was raised. And then when it was destroyed, that site is now dry again. So not that anybody can get to it, but at least it is, in theory, accessible again. So.
Wow. Okay, thank you for that. So now we will invite members of the audience to ask questions.
Very naive question about your profession. to understand words and languages in the past, thousands of years ago, is it a requirement to have a written word or something that is written down? Or if not, how do we understand words and languages that predate the written word?
So it comes back to this idea of the reconstruction. So based on the comparison of related words or phrases or sounds across languages that are deemed to belong to the same family. So you can ask how. So I gave you the star example. Aster, Ister, Istjarnia. In the three branches, Icelandic being a Germanic language, Sogdian being an Iranic language, and Greek being Greek, belongs to its own branch. You can see that in the three branches it's undergone sound changes, and there are linguists know that sounds change rather predictably, again coming back to this idea of there's only certain sounds we can make. So they can sort of extrapolate backwards, if you like, and ask what ancient assembly of sounds could have given rise to those three daughter words in the three branches, and that's how they come up with gester in the case of star or queklos in the case of wheel. So it's in a way it's quite mathematical, the process of working out, reverse engineering the sound changes, if you like, coming back with that reconstructed word. But yes, they're working obviously without historical records. And so they can never say, there are vanishingly few examples where they reconstructed a word, for example, and then later that word turned up in a written script in some clay tablet or something. That has happened, but exceedingly rarely. That's hence the asterisk does a lot of heavy lifting.
Thank you.
Just to interrupt 1 second, do the audience members, can you hear when someone is asking, or would you like a microphone as well?
You can hear.
No? Okay, very good.
Yeah, follow up on the question that was just asked regarding the reconstructions of words. I was amazed to see that you could reconstruct not only words, but you give us the example of the dragon slaying story. So it means that not only you can reconstruct words, but you can reconstruct phrases and a grammar. And I was wondering if there is a way to reconstruct the grammar, or are there interconnections between grammars across all of these Indo-European languages, or is it, how does it work, the grammar part?
I mean, so to come to the myths, it's a lot of what they're doing there is comparing the sort of basic units of myths. They call them mythemes. So for example, something like the concept of a dragon slayer or the thunderbolt, the kind of building blocks of the myth. And it tends to be linguists who are also doing the comparative mythology, and because the stories were told orally, they were performed, they were sung by bards in front of the assembled guests. So a lot of it is about rhythm and about the musicality of it. So these things sort of travel together. The rhythm, the grammar, the sound, and the vocabulary, and the mythical tropes all travel together. And it's because you get these correlations and that they bear the rhythm within them. I'm not explaining it very well. For example, there's an expression that you find in many of the old Indo-European myths of undying fame. So the early Indo-European speakers were absolutely obsessed with immortal glory, dying in glory on the battlefield, essentially. And you have the same phrase essentially in Greek and Sanskrit, meaning immortal fame, undying fame, and it sounds almost exactly the same in the different languages, just with a little bit of sound change. So these ideas travel with the sound because they were performed musically.
You had mentioned that Proto-Indo-European descent came out of the migrations out of Africa. But does that mean that linguists believe that language is a phenomenon that just kind of came up one time, or is it something that could have developed multiple times in different areas independently?
Yeah, that's a thorny question. Okay, so I mean, Indo-European is 5,000 years old, okay? And if you're talking about the actual origins of language, we're going way back before the migration. I mean, most scholars would agree that by 60,000 years ago, when that major migration came out of Africa, we had language that was recognizably language, it was spoken. Whereas if you go back to 100,000 years ago, it might have been something much more primitive, might have even been signed rather than spoken. And then there's a big debate over whether it was 100,000 years ago or whether it even predated sapiens, whether even Homo erectus spoke. And so 300,000 years ago, I mean, partly it comes down to definitions of language, but it's very difficult to determine because, of course, the brain and the vocal cords do not fossilize. So you're kind of extrapolating from skull shapes and from skeletal evidence and from genetics. Now, from ancient DNA, you can make comparisons with genes that we think are involved in language and ask if those ancient hominins also had them. But it's very difficult and remains controversial. Yes, please.
There you go.
Thank you. I'm from Germany, and my father used to say when he was young, in the villages, they still could identify who comes from what village. So obviously, that is also with those different words and the different ways how words differentiate. But why? Why is, let's say, one village have one dialect or way to say words and the other does it differently?
So first of all, that's fascinating because we all live in a world of national languages. I mean, if you look closely, you'll see dialect chains, which is what you're referring to, you know, that the language alters slightly village to village, and, you know, each village can understand what's said in the next one, but if you go, the two ends of the chain may not understand each other. And that was the pattern in the world until about, 200-300 years ago, and then the imposition of the national languages and literacy and standard scripts and so on basically became a little harder to discern. They're still there. And in places like India, you'll see those dialect chains much more clearly. Why does it happen? Well, that's another live question, and I find that fascinating. One idea is that it's to do with geography, topographical variation, and so if there's a mountain chain, two people either side are separated, or a lake or a body of water. But it looks as if there are also quite powerful social forces. So I refer to this in passing, that people may want to distinguish themselves from their neighbors. And so they change literally what a word means, or they change the way it's pronounced. And actually people have been caught in the act of doing this in Papua New Guinea. There's some quite interesting research from there, which is one of the most linguistically diverse regions in the world. I mean, in Papua New Guinea, you can walk from one village to the next, and the language changes from as much as from Spanish to Basque, which are entirely different, belong to completely different families. And, linguistic anthropologists have actually been there at sort of village council meetings where the boss said, right, we're going to change this word to this one so that we don't sound like them. And so that we can confuse them when they come calling.
So, kind of consistent with what you were just saying, it occurs to me in some of more modern historical readings that I've done that Mussolini, autocratic leaders have tried to change. Mussolini is the one that I think of the most, and even the Tsars and Stalin. How successful were they? And because it seems to me like not very much, but maybe you would have a more.
Yeah, they had a real penchant for oppressing regional variants and dialects. Yeah, no, unfortunately they were quite successful. Yeah, they were quite successful, and so we were living with the legacy of that. But now we're in a phase. I mean, I'd say for maybe 50 years now, where people realize, the strategy changed, and now there's an attempt to revive and to valorize regional. I mean, depends where you are in the world, but generally speaking. But they did do a lot of damage, and again, damage. Yes. But then I'm trying to keep the value free, because basically it is what it is, right? The example that I think of is North America at the moment, right? So since about 1970, the main source of immigration to North America, prior to 1970 it was Europe, after 1970 it was mainly South America. Okay, so most of the immigrants coming to North America now are Spanish speaking, and so that's one force. You've got shaping the languages that are spoken in North America, and then you've got a top-down force, which is, for example, in the current administration, the decision to make the US has one official language, and it is English. Right, so all bureaucracy will be in English. Now that is a force. It will shape the languages that are spoken. And the interesting thing to watch in the years and decades to come is how these two forces battle it out in a way. The influx of Spanish speakers and the very significant downward top-down pressure to speak English, because that is the language of the administration and the bureaucracy.
I noticed from the map that you showed that China is an Indo-European language, but Korea and Japan were not. Tibet was not, and I just wondered.
No, China's not either. So Chinese is a part of the Sino-Tibetan family, which is the other great big one up there, and challenging Indo-European for its top-of-the-table status. Yeah, I can't remember what there's definitely none of those are Indo-European, basically.
That makes no sense.
But Tocharian, which is one of the two dead branches of the Indo-European family, was spoken in what is now northwest China. Went extinct in the Middle Ages.
You'll have to read the book to find out the fascinating history of Tocharian A and Tocharian B. I propose that we continue this conversation over a glass of wine. I want to thank you so much for joining us and writing this book. The Ukrainian Institute of America.
Thank you. Thank you to our guests.
Thank you.
For your insightful conversations, your kind of very insightful presentation. And thank you all, our audience, for coming. It's because of you that our events can even occur here at the Ukrainian Institute. And we try to put together topical issues, cultural, political, sometimes educational, social. And it's because of you that we're able to sustain our being. So thank you for coming, and please enjoy the reception. Thank you much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, that's very kind.
Great. Please join us. We can go.
Fabulous.
Can I just do, since I have the mic, I talk a lot, you all know that. Anyone that knows me knows that. Laura's done this podcast yesterday, and we're going to try and share that when that is released. I'm sure it's fascinating. We're also videoing tonight, and we're going to have that on our YouTube channel. Stay tuned. And there are books out there. Anyone who hasn't bought a book can get it there. And would you be so
Yeah, I'd
kind
be happy to
some
sign
books?
if anyone's
Great.
interested.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.